Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us, although it appears to be just us at the moment. We can keep talking for a second, see if some others jump in here. So I was reminded by Monty a little bit ago that Chattanooga boasts as having the fastest internet in the country at 1 gig. But there's some other cities that are now starting to get 1 gig speed. It's funded by the public utility, which is a little bit unique. They are getting ready to go to 50 gig. But right now, there's no equipment that can work that fast. So, even if they push it out, there's nobody that can take advantage of it yet. So they're kind of waiting on the technology to catch up to them, which is interesting.
Yeah. Is that like fiber optics or something? Or what would that?
It's on a fiber optic network.
Yeah.
And as I understand that, the fiber optic that you probably have coming into your house in Cleveland today at, 100 MIPS or whatever, can handle, an exponential amount more than what's being pushed through it at the moment.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating too, you look at what Musk is doing with the satellites, and they're going to have satellite internet here soon. I haven't seen what the speeds are what those are looking like, but I can only imagine they're probably going to be pretty fast, and those should get everywhere.
Yeah, the accessibility of that's really interesting because there's not a hindrance for geography. So,
yep.
So as people start to join us, I just want to say good afternoon. Thanks everybody for joining us. Before we get started, I wanted to make some introductions. So my name is Tom Gaddis. I'm the Dean of Undergraduate Studies at the Columbus College of Art and Design, and I'll be your moderator. Our panelists are Meg Preiss, who's a design researcher and strategist for D-Ford, which is a qualitative research lab within Ford Motor Company. She's joining us from Detroit, Michigan. Evan Painter is co-founder and senior designer for Land Moto, an electric mobility company. Evan is joining us from Cleveland, Ohio. And John Youger is partner at Pine Strategy and Design and on the industrial design faculty at the Columbus College of Art and Design. John and I are both in Columbus, Ohio. In the spirit of this being sort of an open and public forum, we invite you to comment or use the comments to submit questions for us. And it looks like, we're not going to have a huge crowd. So if you want to just turn your mic on and speak up, please say so, and we'll allow you to do that. And I wanted to start with kind of setting the table. So Chattanooga is at a crossroad. The port of Savannah is expanding considerably. Soon it'll be the largest port on the East Coast, if not in the country. Those goods and services will go through Chattanooga up I-75 as they go further places north, west, and east. There's a large and growing startup community in Chattanooga, and the region has become the center for logistics research and exploration. Chattanooga boasts the fastest internet in the U.S. At 1 gig, and it's ready to move to 50 gig. It's a very affordable and a livable city, attracting new residents and tourists to a geographically diverse and unique region, particularly those that are outdoor enthusiasts. Whatever I'm saying wants to turn Siri on for me. There's also a culture of innovation and a great deal of community support for artists, designers, and creatives of all types. It's a great city, and I think Chattanooga is poised to kind of lead this conversation around a connected, autonomous, sustainable, and electric future powered by design. So with that backdrop, the case future is driven by stakeholders' need for mobility. So Megan, can you talk to us a little bit about what the current challenges around mobility are?
Yeah, so I think right now some of the most prominent ones, and again, most challenges within mobility are really intertwined, but sustainability, right now there's a big push prioritizing walking and cycling, which leads to when you put autonomous vehicles into a space of mobility, you're adding this layer of safety now. So how do we keep these cyclists and these pedestrians safe? I think there's also going to be a large challenge of just equity. Right now, autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles are for markets that are more well off. And so to bring everybody into that space, there's going to be a big challenge of creating an equitable vehicle that people can, of all ranges, can afford. And then the last one is just trust. Technology moves really fast, and having people be able to trust the vehicles and trust the advancements that are coming up, or even mobility in general, the changes, it could be drastic, and I think there are going to be some interesting challenges that come with that.
So there's another piece of that too, which I find interesting, which is, cities derive at least some of their revenue from parking meters and parking tickets, and then they spend money on stoplights and crosswalks, and a fully autonomous future wouldn't need that expense on crosswalks and stoplights, but it also means that they would lose some significant revenue, and I'm not sure anybody's talked about that much. I know I haven't found anything yet where people are addressing. I wonder if you guys have anything what do you think that means? What does that mean for a city like Detroit or Cleveland or Columbus, where we are today, or even a city like Chattanooga?
Honestly, I think it means that we should expect to be paying for the utilities of charging your vehicle. Right now, there is free charging in some locations, and I don't know if that will last forever, but I would be open to suggesting that, even the tolls might go up and things like, they're going to find ways to bill and charge you, I guess, for the mileage that you're putting on your vehicle within a city realm. But I think it will altogether be interesting because it's going to put less cost on a consumer, because we're going to have to find new ways to charge us, but we're also being more sustainable in the long run.
There's a interesting proposal in Congress right now that I was reading about, that I forget who the senator or congressperson that's proposing it, but their theory is that as automobiles get more efficient and as we slowly start to transition to more electric vehicles, that the gas tax becomes less impactful. So paying for interstate highway systems is done through a gas tax. Yep. That money's starting to decline. So their proposal is to start to tax people on how far they drive, which is interesting, a little bit scary, but interesting.
Well, I think if you look at, there's route insurance that originated here in Columbus, Ohio. They're, a big component of what they base their rates on is, how much you drive and the type of driving that you do, whether you're obviously you drive maybe slower or faster, but they adjust their rates based on that. I think that's, probably is a foundational element of just what you're talking about, Tom, is, how do you start to look at leveraging usage as a means of determining, how much you should pay and then what that additional fee should be. I could easily see that being added to, I'm sure, like everybody here on this call and those that are also watching, they're probably seeing Amazon trucks on a daily basis in their neighborhoods. Clearly there's usage happening of roads. And so, instead of taxes being calculated, will it be miles to and from your home that will be calculated and then added to? I think that'll be, those types of things will start to be considered and utilized.
Right. So, Evan, your work with land is truly exciting. For the benefit of our audience, you didn't get the tour I got just before this session started, but it's pretty exciting stuff that Evan's working on. While what you're working on today is really, in my opinion, is more sort of recreational use, can you expand on those concepts a little that Land's working on and sort of predict, what other forms of sort of electric mobility might those concepts translate to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that the recreational aspect of our brand, kind of the smaller electric vehicle paradigm, is almost like a stepping stone to reach, what we're talking about today, like autonomous vehicles, more connected grids, and things like that. Working on smaller products, I feel like it gives people a much greater chance of interacting with it. It's a little bit easier to wrap your head around. You could walk around it. You could be with it. It's not crazy expensive. A big thing that everyone's been talking about for the last couple of years is the last mile, but we're kind of like, like the next like 30 miles, kind of like in between that range, right? Mm-hmm. So we're playing in this transitional space that I think is going to be a big stepping stone to getting to where public is comfortable with kind of the autonomous future that we're all looking at right now. So
cool. John, so this idea of a connected, autonomous, sustainable electric future today really seems far away still, right? And there's some recent advances in electric vehicles for sure. And I was sharing with you guys the other day that Los Angeles has bought the first electric fire truck, and they're deploying electric garbage trucks. And there's been advances with buses and all kinds of forms of public transportation. And those seem to be addressing many of the sustainability concerns, at least the immediate concerns. But as we sort of make this transition to a case future over the next, let's call it 10 years, what role does the designer play? And how can design sort of impact all of the stakeholders so they all get a voice?
Sure. I mean, that's a great question. I think I'm hoping that this is a time and a place for design to actually maybe take its rightful place in some of these conversations. If you think about, all of us, we're taught within industrial design. So we've gone through the rigor of realizing that design is not about ourselves. It's about other people, and it's about understanding other people. I think that's one of the things that's super exciting, and I'm sure both Megan and Evan both have great examples and stories based on projects that they've worked on, in which designers have come together and brought in the voices of people that maybe normally we wouldn't hear from, to understand and for us to empathize with, and also to consider within that process. But I think that's an exciting part. I think one of the things, there's some overused language right now within the design community, design thinking being one of them. That's kind of morphed into new language of UX, UI, and customer experience, and also now seems to be more of a service design where we start to look at, broader ecosystems. But I think that's one of the things that's probably the most important part of design and a design approach is this notion of communication, and then language, right? I think Megan got into some of this a little bit earlier, talking about trust. What does it mean to trust technology? Well, if you're really into technology, you may be all about, hey, I love technology. If you're somebody who's not, you may be really scared. It's like, what does this mean? Am I going to have a job? What is this? What does that start to look like? And I think this is where design really needs to bridge, create that communication bridge, in which we start to really openly discuss some of these issues.
So I heard somebody say the other day, and I think you're alluding to this, but is this now the era of the designer? So what they said to me was, design now is at the table, not just on the table. I thought that was really
good. or made the table. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So Megan, design thinking, as John said, it's become ubiquitous. It's kind of an overused terminology now. It's like when I go to Home Depot and I buy designer paint, it doesn't make me a designer. I can assure you it doesn't make me a designer. But anyway, if we, let's accept that term as kind of common language. So how can designers and design thinking help to change perceptions and influence and help manage even our stakeholders?
Yeah, so I think one of the things about design thinking, as cliche as it is marketed right now, is it's really rooted in research, and research means talking to the stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, it's not just the people who are making the decisions, but everyone involved. So who are the people who are buying this or need or want to be buying this? Who's afraid of this? And you're really trying to empathize with every person who is going to interact with this new future to understand where the pain points and opportunities are, and that's kind of the designer gets to be a part of that listening and empathy, and then bringing that to the table where we're really discussing and collaborating with government, with our business people and our engineers, and everyone's coming together. And it's funny you say like it's the age of design, but I think it's the age of collaboration. It's like when we all actually come together and talk and have these conversations and listen to each other to make a better future. And I think it starts with listening to everybody at a table.
That's interesting. The age of collaboration. I think as designers, that's inherently what we have to do. And both you and John have mentioned the word empathy. And building empathy for our users is a principal skill of the designer, right? That's one of the things that separates us, I believe, from other design professions. I'm going to go bold here and make a statement that may get me in trouble. Well, what the hell? It won't be the first time. But the architect, for example, isn't necessarily considering the people that are in the building as much as the design of the building. So that idea of empathy is really, really important.
I do think to push back, I'll push back on you because I'm sure somebody would if they heard you say those bold words. I do think that one of the things that architects probably feel. I mean, I think this is sort of, if you look back at designers in the 40s and the 50s, they would probably say they were architects, right? Or to some degree, there's a lot of overlap with an architect. They were considering things, and then they were creating a vision for that. I think, building off of what Megan, was mentioning of collaboration, I think this is where now, in addition to just listening, those are becoming inputs into that process. And I'll shout out Megan one more time. I mean, I think, 10 years ago, when I was, roughly 10 years, when I first got started at CCAD as an instructor, one of my students came up to me and he's like, "Oh, have you heard about this thing, service design?" I was like, "I don't know if I've heard about that." He's like, "Oh yeah, it's really big over in Europe." And his name was Sean, and he was an awesome student. Anyway, he introduced that term to me, and then he and I sort of looked through a number of books, and then lo and behold, we've got Megan, who's literally just graduated with a degree in service design, just a handful of years ago. So I mean, that just goes to show you that here it's like a conversation, and now she's on the front end, the front edge of what this means and how it's impacting how we think. And it's still changing. I mean, I think this is where the industry is still trying to figure out what does that mean, and how do we make it happen, kind of thing. And those that are businesses that are on the forefront, they're clearly doing those things, and that's why she's involved.
So back to the idea about designing for others, and John, I'm sure you probably had this conversation with some of your students as well, but we often get young design students that will say, but I like this, right? I'm really excited about this concept because I like it. And my response is usually, well, that's great, but you're a market of one, right? We're not trying to design for a market of one. We're trying to design for markets of many. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have a little bit of PTSD when I hear even my students say that word, just because of one of my instructors at Ohio State. When we use that word, we really got a mouthful. His name was Reinhard Buder, who was an amazing professor, but he quickly got us to realize that was not something that really, he was a little more brutal with how he would approach us, but it was basically, nobody cared what you liked. And it was all about trying to understand what was important and what was meaningful.
Right. So I think, this case future is inherently connected to urban planning, right? If we think about Chattanooga as an example, how might the city change? How will transportation modes change? And that planning process is often done somewhat in a vacuum. City leaders, the mayor's office, perhaps the governor's office, whomever. But then there's pushback from the stakeholders because they didn't get an adequate voice, perhaps. So how do we use design to solve that problem? Nobody?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think part of it is, oftentimes one of the biggest hurdles is language. Mm-hmm. So, and it's something that I, tell my students very frequently, but oftentimes deal with, obviously, with clients that I work with now. It's establishing language that works between both parties or multiple parties, because oftentimes, we've got individuals that are coming in, technology good, technology bad, technology scary, all these different things. And that language impacts how people think about things and how they communicate to one another. So without at least an understanding of how people are talking, that can be a real hurdle. So first and foremost, it's understanding how people are talking and what they're saying. And then, oftentimes it's, to build off of that, is everybody treated equal? I mean, I think we all on the surface want to say that, sure. But we know that there's a cost to certain things. Not everything's easy. And sometimes the hardest things are the most important things. So you have to start to prioritize and weight those things and start to figure out what is our ultimate goal here. And that really plays into a vision, and having somebody that is allowing for a vision to happen, not just of their vision, obviously, but having a vision that includes a lot of individuals. So they feel like they've got a perspective there.
Around making sure all those voices are connected. And, while you have a vision and a challenge, then you got to go out and do the research, talk to those users, talk to the stakeholders, talk to the communities, talk to the government, all of those folks to get together then to come to a cohesive, what potentially could be the best possible solution, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to switch gears just a little bit here. To me, this case future is also connected to access. So Chattanooga, like Columbus, like many other cities in the U.S., struggle with education, access to education. Inner city education is often not as good as the private education. Food insecurity, affordable housing, access to health care, et cetera. So, given this sort of backdrop of a case future, what are the opportunities there for communities to enhance not only creating a more mobile society, but access to these other needed services?
I think there's a lot there. Honestly, when I think about a case future and how it impacts all of these other things that are going on, all I can think about is like freedom of movement. Like it allows someone who might not be able to drive a car, or because of a disability that they have, or because of a fear that they have, now they have this ability to get on a moving thing that takes them from point A to point B, whether that's a scooter, whether that's a vehicle. It allows people to have more freedom when they're older. Like, I don't know, when I think about my grandmother, we had to take her driver's license at a certain point due to Alzheimer's. So would it be possible if my mom was busy at work one day that a vehicle just arrived, picked up my grandmother and drove her to her doctor's appointment, and was able to just take her there for her, rather than us needing to be around to really help her through all these things? Like it's going to allow people to be so much more free within what they're able to do, and really empower people, I think, to use that freedom in the different sectors, whether that's going to a school that's a little bit further away because now they don't have to walk, or a city that maybe the air quality isn't so great because of all of the buses. Now, if the buses are autonomous, what does that mean to air quality, which impacts health of babies and newborns? Like it really, I think, is just going to just spread and help every industry and everything it touches.
Access to health care is an interesting challenge because, you can look at infant mortality rates, for example, and you think, it's 2021. Why, as a society, are we still allowing babies to die that way? was because they didn't have access to affordable health care. Seems ludicrous on the surface, right? Granted, I know there's mitigating factors. It's way more complex than I'm making it, but if we could, much of that access is about transportation though, right? They don't have a car. They have to take the bus. It's not reliable, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the same goes for education. I think the same goes for food insecurities. There's segments of Columbus that don't have a grocery store. And so, citizens end up buying food at the 7-Eleven, for lack of better options, right? So they're not healthy. That impacts our overall healthcare system because they're not eating healthy. And then education, education should be the gateway for everybody. A good education, leads to a more personal, sustainable future. Just curious, anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think part of this is we've got the COVID dust to settle over the next handful of years is going to really shake up everything. I even question, is mobility an issue anymore? Because is it really truly about access? And I think if this conversation probably wouldn't have happened more than a year and a half ago, we wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
Right. We'd all be getting together someplace. It's like, hey, let's go to Chattanooga, which would be a great place to go because it's probably not as snowy there as it is here. Right. and that would have sounded amazing. And now here we are doing this remotely from various locations all across the United States. And this is the new norm. That doesn't mean we always like it. But I think this is where that notion of accessibility, thinking about those babies, thinking about telemedicine, thinking about a lot of things, that the conversation has changed. And I think this is where, as truly challenging and as difficult as this past year and a half has been, with everything going on, there's going to be a lot of, I think, hopefully really positive things. And some of that being what we're experiencing right now.
Evan, I know you have you and Megan both have a sustainability passion, right? And which I find interesting. I think that this generation of students, Evan was one of our former students. Megan's kind of one of our former students. It seems like you're way more interested in this than when John and I were in school. And in fact, when John and I were in school, we didn't have many conversations around this. It was, maybe there was a petrochemicals are bad, but that was about it. So I'm curious what you think about the future of CASE and how it will help us attack those sustainability issues. Clean air is certainly one of those.
Yeah, I think, I would say my viewpoints in school has definitely changed. A lot more realities have come to light. So, being in the industry, learning a lot more about it. It definitely seems like it's more of an infrastructure problem now, more than a vehicle type of issue. Being able to charge EVs and actually gather the energy, I think, is where the big sustainability problem lies. It's easy to say, electric vehicles are sustainable, but energy comes from somewhere. And depending on where you're at, it could be hurting your neighborhoods. It could be, messing up your waterways, in a lot of different ways. So, but, focusing on smaller, electric vehicles like I am now, I think just, enhancing neighborhoods and communities with mobility. It's funny. We have a big RV that we use to go on testing trips all around the country, and we started up, and the whole entire shop smells like diesel for like 3 days. It's bad. So it's like, electric. None of that happens. So there's close quarters and type of tight space living, community wise and neighborhood wise. I think these electric vehicles are going to make a huge difference for just livability.
Megan, what about material choice? Seems like there's a lot more options available today than there were, even 10 years ago. as your generation is pushing the conversations, right? So
yeah, there's definitely a lot more material choices out there. I think one of the biggest things about materials in vehicles is just the sourcing of them.
mm-hmm.
When you're thinking about creating hundreds of thousands of vehicles for just the U.S. alone, that's a lot of material that one is needing just for the steering wheel or just for the seats or the mats in the vehicle. And so I think part of it comes down to, there's just balance of where the cost comes from. Is that meaning that the vehicles are going to be more expensive, but they are more sustainable or they have more sustainable features in them? And is the consumer going to pay for that, or is that something that the companies are going to pay for, or is that something that government is going to try to step in and really help these companies kind of pay for that as well? And so there's just this balance of, yes, there's materials out there, but not all of them are sourced nicely as well. So when you even think about paper, is the farm that you're getting the trees from for the paper a renewable farm, or is it actually not sustainable at all and it's hurting more than it's helping?
Right.
And those are the deep conversations that companies are having around sourcing. It's not just like, oh, there's this kelp material that's out there. It's like, well, how is the kelp being sustainably regenerated to make sure that we aren't depleting a source faster than it's replenishing?
So batteries today have an inherent sustainability problem. Most of them are derived from cobalt. The world's supply of cobalt is primarily controlled by the Republic of Congo, which is not a favored nation state, right? And most of that cobalt goes to industrial applications. So think things like cutting tools, saw blades, and that kind of stuff. And then the cell phone companies and the computer companies that use a lot of cobalt to make batteries for their devices are kind of next in line. They're left with kind of the scraps that are behind. In fact, Apple has bought rights to cobalt mines so they can ensure a consistent supply of cobalt to make batteries from. So there's a friend of mine in California works for a company that the name's going to escape me at the moment, but they're looking at zinc-based batteries that have some really interesting properties, one of which it can be foamable, and you can actually spray it inside the frame of an automobile, so it doesn't have to have this big battery bank, that once the life of the battery up is inherently bad, right? So there's some really interesting advances, I think, coming there as well. But I wonder too about if we're thinking about material choice, do we need to make some what am I trying to say? Do we need to make some sacrifices today for payoff later, right? In other words, yes, the prices may go up because we're trying to use smarter, better materials, but ultimately we're paying the price of that is down the road because they're sustainable, right?
I think it's twofold, though. It's not just price. It's also, sorry, I don't know if you...
No, you're fine.
It's not just price, but it's like we need to change the way we materialize the things that we're buying. Like right now you buy a phone and you only use it for 4 years and then you buy the new phone. Or some people buy the new phone every year it comes out. Right. Same vehicles where we drive them and then it's very rare that people now drive it until the very end of its life. And so while we want to, yes, maybe increase the cost or price of cars to make them more sustainable, it's not actually being any more sustainable because people are still not using them to the end of life. So what really the sustainability aspect of mobility is the afterlife of a vehicle or the reuse of a vehicle.
Yeah.
Hang on a second, Evan. I see Alex. I see you hanging out there. If you want to turn your mic on and join the conversation, please do. Go ahead, Evan.
No, I think I think those comments really stick with me. I mean, we've gone through that exercise a lot the past couple months of material choice and being an electric vehicle company, you inherently want to be sustainable as possible. But like you said, sustainability isn't necessarily a material choice. It could be a product design, right? We've designed in a lot of things that help you reuse, the vehicle. So it's not necessarily, we're messing around with the idea of using this woven almost hemp material for body work. It's a composite. It's not plastic. You're not ruining any. You're not creating a bigger issue, but for the cost that would have made the bike and how it would have transitioned to the customer, it's like they wouldn't even have bought it in the first place. So, making things that are accessible that aren't disposable. My friends have been talking about what is it? It's Biffle. So it's buy it for life. You're investing in something long term instead of disposable things. I think electronics and the way we use electronics, especially like the past 15 years, have been very in a manner that things are replaceable. If it breaks, it's just junk. You don't know how to fix it. It's hard to it's hard to maintain products like that. But I think sustainability is it doesn't necessarily have to be a material choice.
Cars are that way too. I think I think about the early cars that I owned. We could fix them, right? You could get under the hood and change a timing belt or whatever, right? You can't do that today, right? I look under the hood of my car today, and there's this molded plastic something or other. I have no idea what it does, right?
And it's really, honestly, going into an autonomous world, it's just going to be harder to self,
diagnose
things or upfit things.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's going to be like software based.
I do think that there's some encouraging things that are happening. I think society as a whole is moving away from ownership. So, just thinking about, do people own a car? Do they rent it? Do they lease it? Do they just use it when they need it? Those types of things in my mind will start to transition some of these discussions because, the company that owns it, I think about all the scooters that sort of took over probably any number of cities over the past 2 to 3 years. Those are having an impact on how we think about, using technology and using mobility. So I think those are really exciting.
Alex, I would say just turn your mic on and join in. And no, we haven't talked about Internet of Things smart city initiatives. So. There he is.
How's it going?
Good.
I've been rotating back and forth between rooms. We have a lot of panels here for the All Power to the People Summit. So I've been trying to get snippets, but I've been catching a little bit about what you all have been talking about. Sounds pretty interesting.
So John and I are both in Columbus, Ohio, and a couple of years ago now, Columbus won the Smart Cities competition, right?
Cool.
An infusion of, I think, $50 million, and then there was another $90 million from local supporters, including Lex Wexner and AEP and some others. And I looked at that maybe with a little bit of designer skepticism in my eye, but what they did with it just seemed so unimpactful. For example, there's a neighborhood not far from our campus called Linden that had all kinds of challenges, and they ended up putting in high-speed internet for the citizens as a part of that. And while that was needed, it didn't solve the food insecurities. It didn't attack the educational shortcomings. It didn't attack access to health care, et cetera, at all. It just seemed like, well, I got internet while I'm in my bus,
Yeah. Well, I think that's why, I love the intersection of talking about technology and the public interest. I've often used the analogy that technology is a lot like an atom. You can split it one way and harness a lot of good energy in the world, split it the other. Next thing you know, you've got the atom bomb, right? So inherently, technology is inert, but how we use it is a result of our culture and our ethics and conversations like this to make sure that it's truly being used for the public interest. One of the things that I've been very interested in is the number of cities that are now starting to announce that they are hiring or exploring a chief innovation officer. And specifically, what does that mean? And oftentimes, my sense from looking at these job descriptions is that it's just a glorified CTO. Whereas in other cases, the mayor or an administration might say, oh, no, we want this to explore all the ways we can do things better. But there I'd be interested in your all's thoughts about the semantics of even just the word innovation itself, because often I think of innovation as innovation is a type of change, but not all change is innovation. And let me be more clear on that. Under change management, there are 4 key functions. This is true of an organization, a company, or even a city. So those 4 functions of change management would be modernization, optimization, integration, and then innovation. And those are all 4 entirely different things. And to get into the definitions of that, to modernize would be just to upgrade a system with something else that's already out there. So that might be, hey, we want to develop a more sophisticated, text response and ways we get information for 311 or for any sort of, information exchange with citizens. To integration might be, hey, here are 2 different departments. Looks like they're doing the same thing. What if we bring those together to, again, lower costs and lower the resources that go into that, because these are taxpayer dollars. And so you've got with integration and modernization, innovation is more focused around actually trying to create something entirely new from scratch, because there just isn't a solution out there. But ultimately, all 4 of those functions, when intertwined, arguably it comes down to this theme that it's about helping, within this context, the city, make smarter decisions faster. So how can you have this intersection within a smart city, within IoT, between artificial intelligence, machine learning, sensor networks, all of these different data inputs come together, not just to display data, but to help increase efficiency and lower the cost in order to provide better, consistent quality of services for all citizens. And when I think of smart cities, that's what I think of, as opposed to, in other cases, IoT, another conversation for another time, but around data privacy and other issues makes me a little weary. So,
anybody want to respond?
I think my initial reaction is part of this is language. So we talked about language a little bit earlier. It's like, just like you said, what are we ultimately trying to do? And I know a lot of projects that I work on, even defining success. What does success look like? And who does that help first and foremost? Starting to think about those things. But obviously, there's lots of different ways to approach many of these things. So how do you go about weighing which ones, provides the largest benefit for the most, or is the easiest to implement the quickest, or has the longest long-term benefit? I mean, I don't think there's any easy answer here other than more conversation and starting to look at the information and what are the impacts of some of these things. But I think, to this point, I don't know that many of these issues that cities have faced historically, they probably haven't been put under the scrutiny of those 4 words that you just talked about, right? They just sort of used classical approaches. It's like, let's just do this, or let's just do this, as opposed to starting to think about these things more broadly. So I think part of this is the conversation has started now. To some degree, what does success look like, and how do we start to get there?
I think it's interesting that the term innovation, I think most of us kind of think about that as the realm of the designer or the creative, but as we were stating earlier, the designer's true role is to be empathetic and collaborative. And so everybody has a part in innovation, right? You aren't born innovative, right? That's not the way it works. And so, you're born innovative, so you're going to go down this path. That's just not how life works. So I think we've been trying to sort of pepper this conversation with this idea of how do we give voice to the voiceless? How do you get all of those stakeholders to have a part in the conversation so that you can deliver solutions that truly meet needs, wants, and desires?
Well, I think for me, what I care about, as a citizen and as a taxpayer, is I want to make sure that we are leveraging technology to its furthest, to the highest extent possible, so that we can create efficient and effective local governments doing their job well for the public interest, and doing so in such a way that we can continue to then have more in the budget to make sure that those people, real humans that are providing services are also paid well to the extent that it's financially responsible to make sure they're cared for as well. And I agree with you. You're absolutely right. Throughout, personally, my search with how city governments are addressing innovation across the U.S., they're not even starting within the context of how do we define the language first. It's throwing around a lot of buzzwords. And again, like I said, a lot of CIOs, chief innovation officers, and other innovation divisions, they're like, we're basically a CTO. we're just trying to figure out, and it's management information systems and it's all that stuff. But ultimately, to think of it from a change management perspective, I think is really the first step, and to introduce that language to the public sphere and the public narrative. Because that's a huge theme of what this forum is about. It's about getting people excited to say, hey, democracy is not a spectator sport. You have a voice. You can be a part of not just being a part of the conversation, but actually framing the issue. And that's really important, because if we don't frame the issue, then often the way we frame the issue is the issue itself. So to look at it from the context of, again, what are things that can be integrated? What are things that need to be innovated? And then the other two pieces, what can be modernized? And then ultimately what can be optimized? Because in some cases, it might be to say, hey, we have a response time to a pothole in the street, and we're able to get to it within 2 days. And we're optimizing and lowering that to 1 day because we're able to get the data of where that need needs to be met to a centralized system, and then that's prioritized and allocated faster. So while I agree that we don't have the answers yet, everyone's still trying to figure stuff out, absolutely. But what I hope we can agree upon is that there are certain principles, and that there is a universal principle, and feel free to push back on this. But I think the core principle is smarter decisions faster. Can we see this intersection of the public sector and public dollars being used to optimize the services that we can provide, and with less cost and less time, which ultimately comes down to, are we helping not only people, but also the technology already in place, make smarter decisions faster to make sure that people get the help and the resources and the promises that were made fulfilled in a timely manner.
So does this come down to what the citizens value? So for example, you're talking about a pothole. If I'm living in a part of the city where I don't have, good access to education, I could give a shit about a pothole getting filled, right? I think that's one of the inner struggles, if you will, of a city is, how do you manage all of those needs to do your best to make everybody happy, and you probably can't, right?
Sure. I mean, that's the nature of anything in politics. You can't have a people policy, but it's your job to try.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately where, again, one of the issues in leadership of any organization, whether it's the private sector or the public sector or nonprofit, is the quality and the quantity of information you're receiving to make decisions. I remember when I spent time out in California, for instance, I went to a variety of different startup conferences and industry meetings, and some of the best CEOs in the Bay were asked, "What do you do all day?" And their response was, "Well, 90% we're just looking at data. We're just with a bunch of data scientists and statisticians and trying to figure out how do we make smart decisions." So it's not just from the gut, but it's actually using real, tangible, quantifiable data to then convert into trends and predictive modeling and all of those tools that are out there to make sure that they're making the best decisions possible. And ultimately, so that would be my sense of that's our goal as not only Chattanoogans, but any city across the country wants to say, how can we make sure that our public officials are receiving the right data streams so that then they can prioritize what makes the most sense based off the constituency that they're sworn to represent.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Alex, one of the things that, and Megan started us off with this word of trust, right? So I think, and we live in a day and a time in which numbers and information, we're seemingly all looking at the same numbers or a version of some number, and nobody knows what to trust. I mean, I think there is a lot of, I don't know if it's confusion is the right word. I think there's definitely a lot of misleading. And I think this is where I totally understand using data, right? Data does help us understand certain things, but I think we all have probably lots of examples in which data and people, we start to lose who we're talking about. And I think that's that word empathy. That empathy, it's like, hey, there are people behind that 3.17% that makes up to 5.6, whatever the crazy numbers and algorithms are. And we know algorithms can be twisted to represent those that may not ultimately benefit the most. They might benefit in more sinister ways. So I think this is where there is some overarching trust related to some of this. And I think anytime you start throwing numbers and acronyms at people, at least I've always told people, if you hear lots of acronyms at a place, inherently do not trust them, because it's a power play. It's me trying to say I know more than you, and that's a power play.
Yeah.
So you have to be cautious.
Yeah, no, I'm actually the self-appointed president for the AAAA. Which stands for the Anti-Acronym Association of America. So I'm totally
you're an acronym carrying member.
I'm an acronym carrying member of the Anti-Acronym Association of America. But no, I hear what you're saying, and I think again, this is where, especially in today's world where we are bombarded with so many different narratives and perspectives and data streams, trust is everything.
Yeah.
And there are two components to that. One is how important it is, and I know you all as designers get this, to have human-centered design, user-centered design. It's important to remember that first and foremost. Why are we designing? Why are we innovating? Why are we developing? Because we're trying to improve the user interface and user experience for a real person, right? And I just got out of this conversation about how to improve the way we celebrate the international community in Chattanooga. And there was some, conversation around infrastructure. Well, we've got the gig and the interstates are here, and it's like, oh, that's great. But also at the same time, there's this whole other component, and that is when people are coming here from other parts of the country and other parts of the world, do they feel welcome? Are they received well here? So that's, and so likewise, as we're talking about this technology, is to think about how people can trust that data, in which case I would just throw out there's blockchain technology and other technologies that can allow us to cross-verify the data that is coming in and then share that data. As I think San Francisco was a pioneer in this. We're now doing this in Chattanooga as well, where we're allowing those data sets to be public for people to analyze and study and make their own proposals and presentations to City Council and to administrations and to their representatives on the state level to say, hey, I've combed through the data and I've got some ideas for how to interpret that and what that means. And then hopefully for that to lead to a healthy civic dialogue.
So
I think there's also a balance of when we talk about data is like right now we're talking a lot about quantitative data, which is number and statistics. And I think there needs to be a balance of qualitative data, which is why, like talking to people and having them tell you and give you insights into why they're doing or need the things that they are. Like quantitative data can tell us that Susie Joe drives 4 miles to work when her work is only 1 mile down the street. And we all might be sitting here thinking like, why is she going 4 miles out of her way or 3 miles out of her way? But until you talk to her, you won't realize that it's because she likes to go look at the grazing pasture as she drives past that way, and it relaxes her on the way to work. And
I would argue that's what she tells us, but what she's really doing is going to get Starbucks.
Well, that too, but like, I think there's just like right now, it's hard to, quantitative data scares people. When you think about Google and all of the data that they're collecting on us, it's scary. You don't know what they're doing with it. You don't know why they want it. And I think it's the same with cities when, yes, they can collect all of this data on me and they're going to collect more data knowing that we're going to be a smarter city. Things are going to start being more connected. But I think building trust is getting out there and talking to people, which brings in back to designers of the communication of like why this is important and why your voice is being heard or needs to be heard in this transition to a smarter city.
So I think we're at a time too, and our political environment is certainly exacerbating this, but I think we're at a time where we as citizens are demanding more transparency with that information too, right? You know, if we just look what happened over the past, 9 months, it's pretty clear that there's not enough transparency there. So with that note, I'm going to cut us off. We have to stop here in a moment and turn it over.
I have a quick request, if I may. I would love to hear examples of how ethics committees are being formed in city governments across the country. So if you or anyone watching this video, please reach out and share with that information, because that's what I'm hearing, and I cannot agree 100% more. It is so important for everyday citizens representing all segments of society to sit at the same table and say what is in the public interest and what is clearly not, to make sure that everyone is on the same page, that technology is being used in a fair and safe way.
That's a good point, Alex. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for turning your mic on and jumping in. Always good to talk to you. John, Megan, and Evan, thanks so much for being here today. I wish we had a larger audience, but those that were here had an impactful afternoon. So we will. It was
a fun discussion.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk to you guys.
Definitely enjoyed the conversation.
Well, and this is going to be recorded, and the way these things usually go is you'll get views in the hundreds or thousands after this is published. Right. So definitely looking forward to hearing more comments and responses after this recording goes live, and actually less than 5 or 10 minutes.
No pressure. That's awesome. That's awesome. That fast. That's really
I don't
great.
remember what I said, but no pressure.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions, Alex.
No problem. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, guys. And we'll turn it over to Monty now. So good to see you guys. Evan, I want to come up and get a tour in person.
Anytime. You know where I am.
Yeah, I do.
I don't leave much. So.
All right, folks. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for participating. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Bye.
See you guys.